Good afternoon and welcome to your library. Today, welcome to your online library. I'm David Leonard, president of the BPL, and it gives me great pleasure once again to host this now annual program in cooperation and in collaboration with the Museum of African American History. Our program today will run approximately 60, 75 minutes or so. We will be in conversation with our very special guest at the start of the program, and we will be taking questions via the Q&A box on Zoom for those of you who are attending live. For those of you who are watching the recording later, thank you also for joining us, and we will be posting some information both live and available on Zoom and YouTube later for viewing. The Museum of African American History was founded in 1967 and is New England's largest museum dedicated to preserving, conserving, and interpreting the contributions of African Americans. The museum has two locations, one near us here in Beacon Hill in Boston, and the other on Nantucket. The Museum of African American History Stone Book Award was founded in 2017. In partnership with the James M. and Kathleen D. Stone Foundation. It is an annual prize that encourages scholarship and writing within the field of African American history and culture by awarding a $50,000 winning prize and two $10,000 finalist prizes to the authors of exceptional adult nonfiction books written in a literary style published in the prior year. This is the award's fifth year, and the fourth year in a row that the winning author has given a talk at the Boston Public Library. This is a partnership that both the museum and the library look forward to continuing. The winner this year is our guest today, Professor Howard W. French, and his book, Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War, is what we will be hearing about today. We will hear from Howard in a few moments. This year's finalists were also Jarvis Givens for Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching, and Taya Miles for All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, A Black Family Keepsake. Both excellent works that we also recommend. You can find more information about these books, the Book Award, and the museum by following the Book Award on social media, hashtag MAAHStoneBA, and also by visiting their website, maahstonebookaward.org. Website features a virtual library where you can search through the more than 300 books that examine and celebrate African American history and culture that have been submitted for the award so far, all published within the last 5 years. These books offer exciting new presentations on both contemporary and historical issues, figures, and events that impact African American and American history. You can, of course, borrow many of these also from the Boston Public Library, either in physical print or online. And for those of you watching, we'll be sharing some information in the Zoom chat box about these works. And now I would like to welcome Professor Howard French. Thank you so much for joining us. You are an accomplished author with several books already, and we look forward to hearing more about your current work. But first of all, congratulations on the award that was presented last night. How does it feel?
Thank you very much, David, and thank you all for being here today, and in the future for those who will watch it in an archived fashion. I can't really answer that question very well. I haven't processed it all together yet. Maybe it happens to be the weekend of my birthday too, and so there's a lot of stuff going on right now. So it's going to take a couple of days to decant, I think, but the initial response or feeling anyway is quite good. I'm delighted to have the work recognized this way and deeply grateful.
Well, it was great to be able to see you and the other two finalists last night talk a little bit about the work and the incredible combined contributions to this field of scholarly work. Would you mind telling us a little bit about what drew you to this particular topic, and how you got started on this journey?
Sure. I would use a different verb rather than drew. I would say drove. And the reason I would say drove is because this book is really a combination of things that, in retrospect, make it seem inevitable to me. First of all is my background, family-wise, biographically speaking. I am the child of the product on both sides of my family of the peculiar institution of American slavery, and grew up in particular very, very deeply familiar with and in contact with my mother's family history, which is recounted a bit in the book, which involves a friend and political ally of Thomas Jefferson, who was the governor of Virginia, who had a child by a woman who he owned, who was an ancestor of mine. And so from childhood, this is something that has driven me, in this vague direction. Then came my career, and so this is not just family background, but biography in a narrower sense. I spent my life as a correspondent for the New York Times over 2 decades overseas in the Atlantic Basin, as a reporter in one place after another that serves as kind of the field of exploration of this book. And I didn't do so with a grand scheme in mind. However, I became aware of lots of these histories in the course of that work, and the intertwining of the many strands only happened subsequently. But I was driven in that direction by the very fact of these experiences. Finally, is something less obvious or intuitive, and that is in my late stages as a correspondent for the New York Times, I worked in East Asia, first in Japan for 5 years and then in China for 6 years. And in that period, late in that period, I began work on my previous immediate prior book, which is a work of East Asian history, most particularly about China and how China over the ages has regarded itself as a power. How has it processed those ideas? And in the research for that book, I was astounded to discover, quite by accident, accounts of Portuguese exploration written in the 15th century by the explorers themselves, which detailed their extensive forays and stays, in fact, in Africa. And as a person who has long loved history and has traveled so widely and who is just fascinated by the human story, I was astounded that I had never come across anything like this before. The 15th century, as I had learned about it, and I think most of the audience has learned about it, was a century of European obsession with Asia. That's what led me to read these accounts, in fact. But I discover along the way, by accident, that 7 decades of that century, almost to the very end, were spent completely, and I mean completely, bound up in a fascination with connecting with Africa for the purpose of producing wealth and getting to understand highly organized societies in various parts of the African continent.
And so I think this is why we heard last night that your work is being heralded as truly groundbreaking, because you are filling in gaps in what the common understanding is of this 15th century period in particular, and how we go from the beginnings of the Renaissance, the start of the colonial period in Europe, an alleged fascination with Asia, as you just mentioned, but rather than going straight to an accidental discovery of what we now call the Americas, there's this whole period of engagement with Africa, particularly by the Portuguese, as I understand it. So why don't we go right there and let's debunk the traditional myth of Da Gama, Americo Vespucci, other Magellan, and then Columbus all suddenly accidentally discovering the Caribbean and the Americas, but rather this detour, a very important detour. And in fact, main focus of these explorers of North and West Africa.
Sure. So the traditional story, or as I think most of us have learned in school, is all about the Asian obsession, which I've already alluded to. But the sort of deeper and truer history that I begin to piece together in this book is that the century prior to the so-called Age of Discovery, in other words, the 14th century, in that century, incredibly important things were happening in Africa. You had an empire in West Africa, in the Sahelian region, called Mali, one of whose leaders was a man named Abu Bakr II. And we have very good, and I mean by good, contemporaneous documentary reason for believing that Abu Bakr II got it into his mind in the opening decade of the 14th century to try to cross the Atlantic, and commissioned boats. And I said boats advisedly, I don't mean tall-masted ships, but commissioned boats to try to get across the Atlantic for purposes of understanding if there is life on the other side of the great ocean. He sends out one expedition. It meets with disaster. There are very few survivors. The head of the mission somehow survives, comes back and reports to the emperor. And then the emperor assembles a larger expedition, which he then takes up the helm of. And he is never seen again. And so we know of this because a successor of his, a man who has actually recently become well known to popular culture for reasons unconnected with my book, named Mansa Musa, sets off on a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 from Mali, crosses 3,500 miles of the Saharan desert, reaches Cairo, and spends months in Cairo distributing patronage. And the form of patronage was gold. Mansa Musa, Mali Empire, sat astride the richest sources of gold known in the world at that time. Mansa Musa I interpret this as trying to make a geopolitical play. He's trying to announce the Malian Empire, which was a Muslim empire, as a major force in the Islamic world. He's trying to introduce Mali in a grand way to the greater Islamic world. And he shows up with 18 tons of gold, 18 tons of pure gold, which he distributes in patronage on his way to Mecca. And this collapses the price of gold in the Eastern Mediterranean. And then the effects of this ripple out and onward into Europe. And so the price of gold is depressed for at least a decade because of these acts of patronage by Mansa Musa. And along with this comes incredible tales of African wealth. And this drives initially quite speculative attempts by Europeans to draw maps, trying to locate where this gold could be, who this Mansa Musa was, where does his kingdom reside, et cetera, et cetera. And then ultimately, a venture or an extended bid by the Portuguese, as you identified the main protagonist here, to explore the ocean by way of trying to find a way to connect to the Mali Empire. And so this begins in the 1430s under Prince Henry the Navigator, who is famous for other reasons. We don't, most accounts of him don't really talk about this very much, strangely. But Henry the Navigator's central obsession in life, in fact, almost from the very start, is, at least under his navigator rubric, is to try to find a way to connect with Africa and discover the sources of gold. And so this continues for decades until the year that appears in the title of my book, 1471, where the Portuguese finally, after Henry the Navigator had already died, discover enormous amounts of gold in what is the modern state of Ghana in West Africa today. And so we'll have opportunity in this conversation to talk about other effects of this discovery, but that's kind of the baseline story, the sort of deeper history here of what set the wheels into motion.
And I apologize for taking you back earlier than 1471 to get started, but I think there's an arc that leads into your work that's worth coloring in the background. And one of the other myths I think that we probably need to decipher, and which I think your work is doing, is that the various African empires, you've mentioned a couple of them already, were pretty sophisticated and really established Whereas the mythology of Africa of this period, at least as I was taught and others were taught, was of much more primitivized or primitive societies. Do you want to go with that distinction a little bit as well?
Sure. I would go one step further, perhaps, in saying that the mythology of Africa down to this moment is of primitivism. That Africa is a place that one is few people in general ascribe any kind of achievement to that isn't derivative of other places. So um, uh, this discovery of gold, excuse me, by the Portuguese is a kind of becomes a motor or a motif in history that sets lots of things into motion. The Portuguese are desperate for their own particular reasons, very interesting reasons. Portugal was, in the scheme of things, although it is an extremely old nation state by European standards, it was still a very young kingdom when all of this was happening. And Portugal was vulnerable to attempts by what I'm going to call for in shorthand, the Spanish. They weren't called the Spanish yet, of course, but the various kingdoms of Spanish wanted to reabsorb Portugal into their realms. And Portugal, having broken away and created its own kingdom, discovered quickly that they had no real financial means of support. That all they had was dried fish, salt, and cork as economic products. So you put that together with the fact that they are on the western edge of the Iberian Peninsula, have no access to Mediterranean trade. They are particularly incentivized to try to set out by the ocean to discover sources of wealth. And so this drives them down the coast and ultimately leads them to Africa.
Right. Which was where they were interested in further exploring. But then this also became the training ground for many of these sailors of this period in terms of how to navigate and go back and forth and trade.
Well, two things are happening, and I forgot a piece of your question in my overly long answer. One of them is precisely what you've just said. This exploration of Africa takes place over a series of decades, 7 decades, 8 decades. And in this process, the Portuguese are understanding ocean currents in ways that would be instrumental to later discovery by Columbus and others, discovery in quotation marks, of the Americas. The other thing that happened, though, is that Henry the Navigator, who's overseeing this exploration of Africa on behalf of a very poor and young kingdom, is looking for gold. Everyone knows he's looking for gold, but for the first few decades, he's not finding any gold. And so in order to finance being a poor kingdom, in order to finance this leads into some initial steps by the Portuguese under the command of Henry the Navigator to seize slaves on the African mainland and to bring them back to Europe for sale in the post-plague years of the Black Death. When European demography had been so hard hit by this extraordinary pandemic, right? Manpower was in short supply in Europe. And so Henry the Navigator's people figure out, oh, we're not finding gold. We need other products we can sell to finance this. And so initially they set out in places like modern-day Mauritania and Senegal to seize people on the coast, sort of catch them by surprise. The Portuguese are showing up actually in full armor in the tropics, trying to chase people in the countryside, and that's not really working very well. But before long, they discover in the first instance in modern-day Senegal, the existence of a very highly organized state right there. And so this sort of gets at the myth of Africa as being, from the beginning until the recent past, just a place of primitiveness. The Portuguese set up diplomatic relations with this African kingdom, the Wolof people of Senegal. They actually bring the king to Portugal. He has an extended stay there. They teach him Portuguese. They're establishing all kinds of official ties. They bring him back. They return him to Senegal. And so this is the beginning of a dramatic shift that would be the paradigm actually until the middle of the 17th century in European-African relations, where Europeans did not try to conquer Africans anymore. They didn't have the means. that there was the disparity in technical and military power wasn't great enough for the Europeans was for the Europeans to be able to project themselves on the African stage. And so instead of looking to capture, to waylay just ordinary people on the coast in various places, the Europeans tried to establish diplomatic relations. They favored looking for the organized states and establish diplomatic relations with people in the places that had such societies, because that was a more profitable way for them to trade and to obtain some kind of wealth out of Africa.
And so it starts with a more generalized trading relationship, but then quickly becomes about, or maybe not quickly. You can help me understand this. It becomes more about looking for additional labor, which in turn leads to the development of slavery as we understand it now. But we probably need, in addition to looking at this timeline, to distinguish between the different types of slavery. It's all slavery, it's all bad, but there are different types that were already in place versus the type of slavery that the Europeans began to engage in, and then we can move further west.
Sure. So the Europeans, I keep saying the Europeans, principally up until this point, it's really just the Portuguese. The Portuguese are treating with highly organized societies in various places along the African coast in their pursuit of gold. They need some kind of commerce in order to sustain their exploration for gold. They have a dire manpower shortage in Europe. And so the Portuguese begin buying people who are enslaved from African societies long prior to the transatlantic slave trade. Of course, you don't have a transatlantic slave trade until Columbus and his discovery, right? And so we're talking about the late 15th century and early 16th century, actually, a period in which at its height in the late 1400s, there were, by some estimates, as much as 10% of the population of Lisbon was African, because of the numbers of enslaved people who had been imported into the European economy. Here, it's worth saying Europe, because the Spanish and others were also desperate for labor, and so they were eager to buy enslaved Black people from the Portuguese, who were the principal conduit for this manpower into Europe.
So would you tell us a little bit about the culture of the time where this becomes acceptable to treat other human beings in this way? Because to us alleged moderns, I'd like to parse what you've discovered in terms of how these conquering powers thought about this, for them, an economic opportunity.
Sure. Well, there's two sides to this equation. They're the conquering power. They weren't actually conquering powers yet. The exploring powers and the African powers, right? These are the two sides of the equation. For the explorers, the Spanish and the Portuguese, or I should put it in the other order, the Portuguese and the Spanish engage in this incredible competition. And I want to come back to how Columbus plays into this in a moment.
Yeah.
But there's a very complicated rivalry between Proto-Spain and Portugal in this period that has several dimensions to it. And they are bidding to the Vatican, to the Pope, to establish the legitimacy of their exploration efforts and their claims to trade and to territory in whatever lands they may discover, right? And so a kind of background feature of what's happening here is this dire shortage or manpower in Europe that I've already spoken to. And then secondly, an ongoing and increasingly severe contest between the Ottomans in the Eastern Mediterranean and Christendom under the auspices of the Pope, right? And so a series of rationales emerges already in the late 15th century under the authority of the Vatican, which says that it's okay to enslave Africans because you're preserving them from falling into the hands of Islam, that we are bringing them into Christendom, and all kinds of rituals, very superficial, rituals, but enough to sort of gain the license of the Vatican, were put into place. People are literally blessed as they walk the plank onto a ship. And then you say, well, they've been converted to Christians, and we've saved them from heathendom from eternal damnation. Therefore, this is a benevolent act. This is a benign thing that we've done.
So religious salvation becomes part of the justification for this act or these acts.
And the other rationale, of course, is the labor. So you put those two pieces together, and this drives the European consideration of what's going on, or legitimation of what's going on in terms of acquiring slaves from Africa. I mentioned two sides to the equation. The African side of this equation is we don't quite have chattel slavery yet. Chattel slavery is going to get invented in Sao Tome in the sort of very early years of the 16th century, right around the year 1500. And I expect we'll talk about that. These Africans are being brought to Europe. They're not really working on plantations, which don't exist in Europe at this in the scale or in the manner that we're familiar with that term, right? But the Africans who are selling these enslaved people to the Portuguese have no conception of the economics or the politics of this in Europe, or of the nature of a racial consideration of the legitimate basis in the minds of the Vatican or the Portuguese or the Spanish of the enslavement of Africans. For the African kingdoms that are trading these slaves, and as I said last night, you heard, I'm not trying to make it sound like being a slave is a good thing, but for the African kingdoms who are selling slaves to the Europeans, they don't have a concept of African. They just are selling the people in neighboring societies who were the losers in localized wars. They have not come to a racialized conception of this thing called Africans and another thing called Europeans. And the Europeans are trying to take over Africa or prevail over Africans, or have categorized Africans as subhuman. What they are doing is saying, this is a business deal. The Europeans have brought prestige goods, rare items that are not available in our societies that are desirable. And we have captured human beings on our hands who, from places that we have defeated in war, some of whom, because of their number, are difficult to absorb. And so we're just selling a surplus. It doesn't sound pretty or happy, but that's basically what was going on.
So to the extent that there were conquerors at all during this early period, it was really the stronger African identity groups that were playing that role. I mean, not that the Europeans were guiltless by any stretch, but we'll see them as conquerors, in quotes, if you will, as we get later and come west. I think the importance of gold to Europe during these centuries is also worth commenting on briefly, which is where the other agenda for Christianity and the churches and the buildings comes into play as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, gold, of course, has been a motor of history. In fact, there's an epigraph in my book to this effect, which I like a lot. Gold has a very old history in human society as a means of a store of value and a means of trade. And as an item of luxury and something considered precious. So there's nothing really new to that, right? But gold is gold in this particular era, by sort of from the perspective of Africa, by unfortunate historical coincidence, is also in dire short supply. And the reasons for that have to do in part with the Crusades against the Muslims in the Middle East, which were very costly wars. And then on the other hand, and this might seem a little more surprising to some listeners, but just ordinary religious pilgrimage. Pilgrims traveling from Europe to realize their sacred duty to try, much as Muslims do even today, to try once in their lifetime to visit the Holy Lands, right? Needed specie to do that. And specie came in two forms. It came in the form of silver, and in the form of gold. And Europe was in short supply in this period of both of them. And so this also drove an intense, or an unusually intense interest or motive in acquiring gold along the coast of Africa. This is so important to all of the history we're discussing today. But it's also it also happens to be a piece of the account of what happened in the creation of the New World that is entirely left out of most of the historiography. We just think that it all begins with the enslavement of Africans, and suddenly they're being shipped across the Atlantic. Well, as we've already seen in this conversation, there's a prior phase where there's enslavement for market, for sale in Europe, and we've also heard that it was gold and not slaves that was the driver of this commerce in the first place.
Right. And I'm getting the sense that we could probably go on for multiple hours, as this is both interesting. I'm fascinated by your work, and this is clearly your expertise. In the interest of our audience, though, I would like to start to take us west. So Columbus goes astray. So there's the discovery of modern day Brazil. There's the Columbus's own journeys and the return, and then we start to hit the modern day Americas, or as we would call them now, and then the development of this moving from the slavery types that we've discussed to what will become slavery as pure property, pure ownership, and its own unit of trade as well.
Sure. So on Columbus, another argument that is rolled out in this book, which is I think firmly documented in my book and in other, didn't discover this, in other works that are not have not been incorporated into the traditional narratives. Columbus was well known as a sort of explorer for hire long before his famous feats. He had traveled from one court to another in Europe, trying to sell them on the idea of financing his voyages for his eccentric idea of discovering a way by going west across the Atlantic to reaching Japan and China. He was laughed out of one court after another. So why did the Spanish, near the end of the 15th century, decide to back Columbus? Well, the answer to that is a very interesting thing. The Spanish, I believe, and I think this is well documented, Spanish finally, actually, this is the second time that Columbus has approached the Spanish. The Spanish finally consent to finance Columbus's voyages precisely because the Portuguese had made the breakthrough in the discovery of gold in Elmina, the port in Ghana, where the Portuguese built the first tropical outpost of Europe anywhere in the world. And they are suddenly, in the space of very few years, Portugal's treasury is bursting with gold. Portugal had been cork, salt, and dried fish, as I said earlier. Suddenly, Portugal is a gold power, right? The Spanish decide we had better finance Columbus now because there's this notion that emerges from the Portuguese discovery that gold must be distributed geographically in a certain band of the tropics. That if, everybody had been looking for gold. The Portuguese find it near the equator. So now the Spanish have bought into this idea. It must be near the equator that one finds gold. Let's pay this kook Columbus to try to do what he says he's going to do. We're not really interested in the Japan thing part of it, right? If he finds gold, that's good enough. Sure enough, you see in Columbus's diaries, from the first day of his arrival in the New World, Columbus is recording for the purposes of reporting to Ferdinand and Isabella how much gold he's discovered. That's the most important thing he's talking about, which is one of many ways of validating this story. Anyway, in the meantime, at the same time, the Portuguese have discovered a tiny island off of Central Africa called São Tomé, which is just off the equator, uninhabited at the time of their arrival, mountainous, tropical, heavily rained, very fertile, heavy seasonal rains. And the Portuguese introduced there a new commercial crop that was just making its way into the European marketplace. And that crop is sugar. And they discover that sugar cane grows in São Tomé in the most explosive ways you can imagine. And so no one knows who introduced it there, but this all happens right around this same time. And the Portuguese then begin to look for manpower on the African mainland to plant, grow, and harvest this sugarcane. And this is the birth of chattel slavery. What is chattel slavery? Chattel slavery is where you have people who have been enslaved on a racialized basis in a transgenerational way. In other words, they and their offspring in perpetuity on the basis of their race are going to be slaves. And so this is the birth of the plantation on the one hand, but twinned with this notion of chattel slavery. Excuse me for being long, but you mentioned Brazil. And then right at that same time, they discover Brazil by accident. And sugar, plantation slavery, and chattel slavery all across the Atlantic in a flash. And we're off to the races in the development of the New World on the basis of this new institution of chattel slavery.
Now, you introduced the term, right, so there's two developments here with respect to slavery. One is, it's more formally chattel or ownership as property than it has before. The second is it's actually racialized. It's the second point I'd love to have you unpack and tell us what's going on and what's that shift. It's no longer the, conquered peoples, but there's something else happening here with the concept of race being introduced.
Well, Europeans had like peoples everywhere, had a long prior history of slavery. The Europeans had traded slaves among themselves for going back from time immemorial, right? What is new here is the combination of greed and profit lust and opportunity with an available victim, and the available victim was the demography or the people of the African continent. They make this discovery. It's a series of incredible accidents here, but they make this discovery in Sao Tome that sugar, this is the ideal sort of environment to grow sugar in. And Sao Tome is just a couple hundred miles off the African mainland. And so the Portuguese then sort of work out a series of diplomatic arrangements on the African mainland with organized kingdoms, one of them an extremely impressive organized kingdom called Congo, spelled with a K. The Portuguese established formal diplomatic relations with Congo. They had ambassadors going back and forth. The Congo had bishops who were ordained in the Vatican. The Congolese adopted Christianity or Catholicism as their official language. They adopted Portuguese as the language of the court, etc. And by virtue of these sorts of relations, the Portuguese were able to source labor in the form of enslaved Africans in the region of the Congo, first for exploitation in chattel slavery-driven plantations in Sao Tome, and then with the discovery of Brazil in 1501, right away in the sort of continental New World.
And then it goes from, so what's the relationship like between the new arrivals from Europe and the native peoples in this new world, whether it's Brazil or South America, or then a little bit later, further north as we get into the 1600s and beyond? I mean, we know disease will become a part of the tragedy that the native peoples will experience as a result of the Europeans. But early on, why go all the way back to Africa for labor rather than use what's at hand, to be crass about it?
That's a really important question. The reason, which you have largely but not entirely identified, has to do with epidemiology. The Europeans arrived in the New World, and they carried with them diseases that were not familiar to this, what doctors call naive population of Native Americans. They had never been exposed to even the common cold was alien to the New World, and so for a long time, soon upon contact, Native populations died in large numbers wherever the Europeans went. And there's an extraordinary literature about this, of the Europeans not there was no science yet in terms of disease science. The Europeans had no germ theory. They had no understanding really of what's going on. And so they interpreted this largely in religious ways, that this is because of the sinfulness of the natives who walked around semi-naked, and they had to be, forced to pray harder and had to be prayed for harder, et cetera, et cetera. But everywhere they went, unfailingly, there were huge epidemics which killed extraordinary numbers of people. So this was one piece of what made it difficult for the Europeans, or the Portuguese in this instance in Brazil, but all Europeans throughout the New World, to harness the labor of Indians, so to speak, in the pursuit of plantation agriculture. The other thing is, in the landscape of Brazil, what is now known as Brazil, this enormous, vast, heavily forested territory, is that the natives had extraordinary facility of egress. They could get away. It's hard to build a corral big enough to keep the people in that you need to keep in. And the natives know the way around. They know the pathways. They blend in easily. One of them's hard from the perspective of the Europeans to distinguish from the other. But take an African and put him in that environment, after you have equated blackness with slavery via chattel, when the institution of chattel makes blackness legitimizes blackness as the human category for use in enslavement. To see a black person is to see a slave. And so finding a black person wandering around this has resonances with American history, meaning the United States history. Simply seeing a black person who's not under obvious immediate physical control by a European means you have a problem. That's an escaped slave. Whereas seeing a native person that way is an experience of a different sort of register. And so for these two reasons, epidemiology on the one hand, and the kind of facility of identification and assignment into slavery via skin color on the other hand, these are the two reasons why Africans, the Europeans, resort. It doesn't happen immediately. They discover Brazil. Portugal discovers Brazil in 1501. It's not until the 1570s that you have a total transition to almost no Native Americans being used in efforts at running plantations to entirely African populations.
And I assume that because some of the new settlers that start coming from the 1620s on to North America, at least, are coming with a backdrop of a more Puritan Christianity, or that makes it easier to do exactly what you did in terms of explaining away the alleged primitiveness of the native peoples that they discover here. And so that narrative makes complete sense. I think also some of the what we would now know as Caribbean islands were not inhabited until the arrival of these settlers, conquerors, slave traders, and the enslaved peoples they brought with them.
Correct. I mean, Barbados, which becomes a site of enormous wealth production for England, was a virgin island. There was nobody there when the English showed up, and so they arrive in Barbados. This is sort of contrary to the way we, I think, tend to remember this history. But the English were actually relative latecomers to all of this. The Portuguese were the forerunners. Then the Spanish got in a big way, and the English are sort of
the Dutch as well before the English
come in next, and then the English are watching all of this and seeing other people get rich and more powerful and feeling sort of left out. And so they didn't have the means to frontally compete with the Spanish yet in this period. And so a bit of good fortune, they stumble on an island in the Lesser Antilles, which means the Eastern Caribbean, close to the South American coastline, which we call Barbados today, uninhabited, undefended by the Spanish. And they copy the Portuguese methods that were invented in Sao Tome of building plantation agriculture using chattel slavery. And it takes off, as you would expect, like gangbusters. And so from 1630, in the first decade or two, the English are using indentured white servants for the labor. They phase them out very quickly. And beginning from the second half of that century to the end of that century, the English have made more money by grinding Africans' lives out in plantation agriculture than the Spanish had earned in carting off all of the gold of the Aztecs and the Incas.
Amazing. I want to ask you why you think this is more of a meta question at this point, because I will want to get to some audience questions in a few minutes. But there are a couple of big questions I have myself still. One of which is, why is this part of the story not what was taught in school, or that, was it known or just not known? Because sometimes things are known, but no one wants to talk about it, and at other times it actually does become a new discovery.
So there's something I feel proud about in my book that is a little unusual for an author to say, and that thing is relates directly to your question. I didn't really discover anything that had not been discovered before by others in the research and the writing of this book. This is a book that I spent years and years of research on, that has 50 pages of footnotes, right? It is deeply researched and deeply documented, but I didn't discover anything that had not been commentated on or remarked by someone else. And so this forces you to ask, why is it then that this history is so unknown? I do believe that I've put the pieces together in ways that others perhaps have not before, and joined geographies in ways that others may have not before, and find different points of emphasis. But in terms of the nitty-gritty little details about what happened in Sao Tome or Barbados or this place or that place, it was all there in the archives, right? So why has this not been told this way before? Why haven't we not built a big picture sense of this quite like this before? I think the answer has to do with the moral taint that obtains from the construction of the modern world on this basis, that Europeans, like people everywhere, and Americans, like people everywhere, would like to find virtuous ways to conceive of their own histories and to emphasize the things that flatter them, right? And there are many nice things to remember. The Enlightenment did have beautiful ideals, and Europeans and Americans, I'm not here to argue, are nobody is all bad, right? There's good stuff in everyone's past, but the scale of the horror that obtains in these processes is so great that I think it created an irresistible impulse to sweep things into the corners and to turn off the lights with regard to many of the uncomfortable details, just because it made it so hard to sustain the kinds of feelings that we all as human beings would like to sustain about our pasts and our own achievements.
A form of cultural denial, if you will, about the reality that we all belong to, regardless of the color of our skin or our own identities.
Correct. So we would prefer to pay attention to the scientific method, or the Judeo-Christian values, or the Protestant work ethic, or one thing after another, all of which have pieces of truth to them. But from the moment you begin to scratch into these uncomfortable things, a lot of that stuff begins to totter, and we haven't found a sufficient degree of courage. In fact, even at this late date, we're talking about histories that begin in the 15th century. We haven't found sufficient courage even yet to fully confront these things.
Well, I think this is why, in some ways there's some distance to this period. And so I think, the early 1400s and 1471, where you formally begin, is somewhat easier to talk about. I'm personally, as an amateur historian, I'm impressed by the chronology that you're putting together and tying the sequencing together. In particular, I think it's incredibly illustrative of what I certainly knew very little about, other than what I was taught in school. So thank you for that, absolutely. And then certainly in the US, it's 350, 400 years later, where we go all the way to the Voting Rights Act, and we maybe we can talk about the last 50 years another time, but certainly looking at where the roots of this period and how we deal with what it means to be Black in the U.S. Rooted in this period is so essential. Maybe before we take audience questions, let's return to the title, the Born in Blackness piece of it. To tell me what you're conveying with that, and then I want to hear why you choose to stop at the Second World War.
Sure. So Born in Blackness, in part because we're talking throughout the book about Africa and Africans and about the African diaspora. And so in that, at the most immediate level, that's what we're talking about when I say Blackness. And, I'm making the case, as no reader I think can miss, that Black people have been at the center of modern history from the very beginning, have been essential drivers, have been pillars of modern history from the very beginning. But Born in Blackness has a sort of double entendre sort of quality to it as well that relates to your previous question, and that is, why don't we know all of this stuff? And I said, because of the taint that obtains from all of this. There is this enormous moral taint, a horror, a monstrosity that attaches to the exploitation of human beings on the scale that this history speaks to, and over the length of time that this history speaks to. And although this is not a favorite, nor ordinarily favorite usage of the word Black for me, but this is a traditional use of the word Black, that something Black is something that is morally tainted, that is bad, that is negative, that's pejorative, that is actually dangerous and horrible. And so the modern world is not just born of the agency and the labor and the actions of Black people, but also of the horror that was inflicted on Black people. And so that's for that piece of the title. You wanted me to talk about Africa and Africans, or was it the modern world? I don't remember which is.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to note why you stop at the Second World War, and why that's the closing parens, if you will, to this book anyway, at least, of the story.
So there's two answers to this question. I'm not going to make it long, but I hope it's not too flip. One of them is I had to stop somewhere. It's a 500 page plus book, and so there's that. The second answer, and it's spanning 6 centuries, but the second answer, somewhat more serious, actually, from personally a lot more serious, is that my next book, a project that I'm working on now, picks up at the Second World War, and will proceed to tell the story of what I think is perhaps the greatest, if not the greatest, one of the greatest stories of our present era, an era that begins in the post-war period, of the independence of the African continent and the freeing of people from colonial rule, not just in Africa, but more broadly. My story will center on Africa. We in America, where most of this audience will be, our own sort of priorities in terms of assigning importance to historical events. We have the greatest generation, and we would like to talk about World War II, and certainly the founding of this nation, all of which are fine topics. But I'm going to make the case that the freeing of peoples from colonial rule around the world at the end of the Second World War and beyond is certainly one of the most important things that has happened in living memory. And I hope to make a convincing case for that.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think obviously in our conversation so far, we have largely focused on the very early parts of this period that you're covering. So there is a lot more for people to read and explore if they will either buy your book or borrow it as they see fit. I'm going to take some of our audience questions at this point, and some of them I think are pretty straightforward. A few of them look nuanced so far. For those of you who are joining us online, please feel free to drop a some additional questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. We also have a few from registration, so we'll go through those as well. Howard, this question I think we may have already touched on in particular, but the choice of words here I want to share with you in case there's anything else you want to add or additional nuance. Carmen says, would you describe the impact of the doctrine of discovery on the African slave trade and the subjugation of peoples of color?
Yes, so this is a question that may lose a number of our listeners here, but the doctrine of discovery relates to the processes of religious and political legitimation of the activities in the first instance of the Portuguese and the Spanish as they proceeded to quote unquote discover things in the modern era. So the modern era is, I think, modern is a highly contested term. It can be interpreted many ways, but I think in one of its most simple definitions or commonly used in definitions is the era that begins with the discovery, quote unquote, of the New World by Columbus, right? And so the European powers that were contending in this age of discovery had a problem of how to legitimize their claims to the lands, and in the cases where these lands were inhabited, claims over the peoples in the lands that they discovered. And the Christian faith was deeply involved in these processes of legitimation, and so the Vatican conferred legitimacy to the powers that discovered new lands and made claims on peoples in those new lands on behalf of Christianity. And this is sort of the sort of background or the contextual definition of this doctrine.
Using divine destiny as some sort of justification for not just slavery, as we talked about earlier, but the acquisition of these lands, right?
That's right.
Got it. The next question is from someone who volunteers at a kids community center in their parents' home country, Cabo Verde in West Africa. She plans to donate books, particularly your book, China's Second Continent, and the kids there are taught to read in Portuguese. Any plans to translate this work into other languages?
Thank you. So I'm delighted to be able to say that this book is being translated into lots of languages right now. And most pertinent to your question, there is a Brazilian edition in the works, and there is a Portuguese edition in the works. So you'll have your choice as to whether you'd like to read it in Portuguese, or in Brazilian Portuguese.
And this reminds me, one of the questions that we did get at registration also related to explaining why Portuguese became the spoken language of modern day Brazil. I think we touched on this because it was the Portuguese explorers who really became the dominant explorers in that part of the world. Is there anything else that you would want to add color to on that point?
Well, you know, the background I gave you earlier in the talk about Portugal's emergence as a power in Europe and in the world emphasized how small and how weak and poor Portugal was. And so it's really impressive to me, even having already written this, to think back at the kind of incredible ascension or rise that Portugal experienced. First, discovering gold in Elmina. Within 3 or 4 years of that, they renamed the treasury in Lisbon the House of Guinea. Guinea meant Africa. They renamed the treasury of the state for Africa. That's how important the gold from Elmina was. Then a few years after that, they figure out how to invent this new institution called the plantation, using chattel slavery, as I described, and they are making enormous profits from that. This is incredibly compressed 2 decades. And almost simultaneously, they discover Brazil, and they then begin to settle Brazil and to bring Brazil under Portuguese exploitation. This is just, for a place the size of Portugal, this is kind of incredible. The amount of territory that Russia just tried to formally annex in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago is the size of the country of Portugal. Portugal, I can't tell you how many times larger Brazil is than Portugal, but I can assure you it's quite a few times larger. So Portugal is experiencing this almost an unheard of expansion in a very compressed period of time, both in wealth and in territorial extent.
And just building on the questioner's point, it's probably impossible to disaggregate the arrival of the Portuguese as explorers and the impact of slavery. In both cases, it's Portuguese as the spoken language that ultimately becomes the dominant European language in that part of the world.
That's right.
This is a pretty posed as a yes or no question, but is maybe we can build on it as well. Asking if you're familiar with the Africa Map Circle. The questioner appears to be suggesting that there's interesting history of West African maps. From my own experience, I would note that many of these borders are pretty arbitrary in the modern era. I'm just wondering if there's something there that you would like to comment on as well.
I am not familiar with that outfit. I was asked a map question yesterday in my talk, and I wonder if this is perhaps the same person. In that yesterday's question, I was asked about African maps, and I said that the kingdoms that succeeded each other in the Sahel in the general area of Mali were Islamic kingdoms that used Arabic language as the official written language of the court. And these places developed maps of their own, of their immediate surroundings and of the region. And so this is the most important source of African maps that I'm familiar with that survived down to today. But as you mentioned, David, modern African maps, borders were sort of fanciful and almost arbitrary impositions by European imperialism, and this comes up a little bit in my book, have created a whole set of complications that the African continent still wrestles with.
We're certainly willing to take more questions from our online audience. If you have a question, please drop it in the chat. I'm going to, in the meantime, return to a couple of my own questions to keep the conversation going. In some ways, I think because the U.S. and North America is grappling with its history of racial injustice and of slavery in newer ways, I read this book through the lens of the American perspective and trying to understand the country and world and issues that we experience today in civic society. But I'm also aware, as I listen to you, that in some ways this is also a history of an African experience specifically as it relates to Europe. I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on how you think about that distinction as you think about your book.
It's an interesting question. I had many preoccupations in writing this book, but the two that most immediately seem to relate to your question were, for me, to reinsert American history into world history in new ways.
African history or American history? Sorry.
American history into world history in new ways. And that new way in particular involves Africa, as is pretty obvious from the title and from our conversation today. But a second important motivation for me was not just to make this a history of Africa or of Africans, but to make clear to anyone who persists through the book that wherever you are from, your history is African history. That's what it means. That's what I mean by the making of the modern world. Everything that you take for granted in today's life can be traced at 1 or 2 or 3 degrees of separation from the experience of this connection that's made between Europe and Africa in the particular moment in time that I described in the 15th century. Everything flows from that. This is the most I argue, the most instrumental thing that happened in the modern era. And therefore, I don't care if you are Indian or Russian or Canadian or Lithuanian. I can figure out a way in a few minutes to tell you how this all is actually your history too. You know, there's a very common in the sort of narrowly American context of in discussions of race of some people saying, well, my ancestors were not here at the time of the slave experience in the United States, or, you know, we were not involved in the slave trade, or I'm from the North, or various things like that, which are imagined to be effective ways of saying none of this is your history. And my book is actually an extended rebuttal of that. And this is not a rebuttal aimed at making you feel guilty. It's a rebuttal aimed at making you understand the true inner workings of the making of this age and how inescapably central Africa was to those processes.
And yes, Africa, but also people who identify as Black and are part of the race. Those two become inseparable as we go through the book, which I think is important as well.
Absolutely.
I mean, in some ways, to your last point, as someone who grew up in Ireland and came to the US for graduate school a few decades ago now, initially I felt distant from this experience for exactly the same reasons you just talked about. But the more I've unpacked the history of this country, I realize that it's not a stretch to say that all of this history made it easier, perhaps, for me to make this choice, not about me personally, but about the privilege and background and systemic structures within which that choice becomes easier for me than maybe it would be for others.
Thank you. I agree with that completely. Let me offer another way of thinking about this, which complements that. I make the argument in the book that the creation of the West itself is a result of this history. And so listener may be thinking, what does he mean? How can the West have been created by this? I can explain very quickly. Up until the year 1820, 5 times more people were brought from Africa to the New World than from Europe. Up until the year 1820, I repeat, 5 times more people were brought from Africa to the New World than from Europe. What do we think those Africans were doing? Those Africans were laying the groundwork for European settlement of this hemisphere. Had it not been for those 5 times as many Africans, is it possible to imagine that we would be in the place we are in on the time scale that we're talking about today? I find it difficult to imagine. The Africans were doing not just the cultivation, but the ditch digging, the road laying, the construction and building, every kind of arduous labor. And Africans, by the way, were not only confined to arduous labor; they did other things as well. But they were brought here in the most immediate sense to do all of the things that European labor could not be counted upon to do, either for reasons of insufficient quantity or for reasons of distaste. And so it is the creation of a viable a prosperous economic realm in this hemisphere, which is the basis of the West being a kind of condominium between Europe and the other side of the Atlantic. Without this prosperous other side of the Atlantic, you don't have a West. And the prosperity on this side of the Atlantic was created out of that groundwork. This groundwork from 1619 in the American case until 1820, just for starters, when 5 times more people were being brought from Africa than from Europe. And so you may think I'm not talking to you, David, you've already spoken to this eloquently, but a listener may think he or she doesn't have anything to do with this history. But if you think of yourself as a Westerner, you've got something to do with this history. You have descended from this history.
Thank you for that. And it is part of our shared history as a nation or a Western world or a people whether we can draw those lines personally or not. So it doesn't appear that we have more questions from our audience. So Howard, I'd like to start bringing our conversation to a close and ask you for just some general thoughts around what do you hope people who will read this book will come away with? What is your message for us as a species, really, in some ways?
Well, I've been asked in certain audiences and giving a great many public talks about this book, how it is that I managed to sustain an even tone through the book. That, why don't you sound angry? I don't know what I sound like as I speak, but on the page, apparently I impressed a lot of people with a kind of quiet or serenity or calmness in the face of history that I've already with you called horrible.
Dispassionate, perhaps.
Dispassionate is the word I'll take. I wasn't conscious of struggling to do this as I wrote the book, but I'm happy to hear those kinds of comments precisely because I don't think that anger or the wielding of guilt are the best ways of opening people's minds. I think they have their place. I'm not saying anger doesn't have its place. I'm not saying that guilt doesn't have its place. But in terms of creating connections intellectually with people that are going to bring them, in the best of cases, to think in fresh ways about themselves and about their lives and about the connections that they have to other peoples and about where they come from in history. I think that keeping things on an even keel with a spirit of that lacks a kind of stern indictment to it is perhaps the best approach. And so I invite my readers to, or those of you who wish to read the book, to enjoy it at that level and to see if in fact the book works on that basis for you.
Right. Well, I would agree that I think emotion and passionate response to realities certainly have their place. But what binds us together maybe is something that we have thought of as quintessentially modern, maybe more in its promise than its reality, and that is the use of reason and intellectual understanding. And the more perhaps we can have a shared understanding, even if we don't always have a shared background or shared identities, perhaps that will be better for ourselves and for our democracy. So, Professor French, Howard, thank you so much for your contribution to our intellectual thought and our conversation today. I have learned so much, so thank you. And once again, congratulations on the Museum of African American History's Stone Book Award. You are the 2022 winner. Congratulations and good luck with that second volume that you were telling us about, or the new book that you were telling us about.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you. And for our audience, you can order this book from our independent bookstore partner for this program, that is Frugal Bookstore. And of course, you can also check it out from your local library. And now we'll just bring up a slide about some upcoming programs. Well, perhaps due to a technical difficulty, we will not be doing that on this occasion, but we will add that to our, there we go. So yes, thanks to Frugal and upcoming programs at the library. I will actually be in conversation with the author Robin DiAngelo on some related topics about current day topics that are similar to today's this coming Monday. That will be a hybrid program in partnership with the GBH Forum Network. Robin DiAngelo's latest work, Nice Racism and White Fragility, will be the main topic. That is in person and online. On November 14th, we will have a related program in partnership with American Ancestors, New England Historical Genealogical Society, NEHGS, and that is about the Grimke's, the legacy of slavery in an American family. And then at the end of November, I will be back with author Neil Gabler, Against the Wind, Edward Kennedy and the Rise of Conservatism, 1976 to 2009. So please feel free to check out these and other programs of the Boston Public Library, as well as other programs and events for today's partner, the Museum of African American History. Once again, thanks to everybody who put this together. Thank you for joining. Thank you for watching. Once again, Professor Howard French, thank you so much. The work is Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War. Thank you. Good afternoon.